The Fallout Wasteland is made possible by its Great War, a devastating worldwide event that triggered a new, terrifying era for humanity, and revelations that are still being felt hundreds of years into the future. What exactly do we know about the conflict and its origins? Fortunately, quite a significant amount. I'm Mark from Digital Dissection, and today we're investigating 9 facts about the Great War of the Fallout universe, its causes, and the events surrounding its devastation. While it's not exactly a mystery that the Fallout property involves the unchanging appetite for mankind's tendency to go to war, the beginning of its conflicts isn't necessarily always at the forefront. Normally we end up seeing Fallout's societal designs and the future of tomorrow look reminiscent of early 1900s World's Fair advancements that tend to take center stage. But its divergence from our world, shortly after the events of the Second World War, make it unique. The Earth's focus shifted considerably, developing supercomputers, compact nuclear fusion power, and nuclear fission, otherwise known as splitting the atom, which releases incredible amounts of energy. Crude oil, and traditional fossil fuel, became a secondary source of powering the world's economies, which began to slowly run out, one country at a time, leading to the eventual invasion of Mexico by the United States in 2051. This action by the US kicked off what became the first steps of the Resource Wars, which was detailed in the Fallout Bible.
The year 2051. Seeking to protect business interests and their oil supply, the United States begins to exert increasing pressure on Mexico, citing the political instability and pollution stemming from Mexico as a threat to the United States. Various economic sanctions serve to destabilize Mexico, and the United States military enters Mexico to keep the oil refineries running, and making sure oil and fuel continue to make their way north across the border, at Mexico's expense.
The invasion would end up doing very little for the United States, as its source of fossil fuels had already dried up, with Texas oil fields completely barren, which would be featured in a documentary that would air across the world. With energy sources becoming difficult for the world's countries to manage, the Resource Wars officially began in 2052. Smaller countries began declaring bankruptcy, and many took notice of Middle Eastern companies raising their crude oil prices to meet the overwhelming demand of the wide-felt shortages. This turned the Resource Wars into multiple conflicts happening at the same time, as the European Commonwealth banded together to address the rising oil prices by moving military forces into the Middle East. In the wake of the aggressive actions taken by both the US and Europe, the UN called emergency sessions to address the desperation felt by the world's diminishing energy sources. With no reasonable steps forward, the UN could do nothing but watch its member nations wage war against each other. By the end of July 2052, the UN officially disbanded. An event detailed in newspapers featured across Fallout 3's loading screens. The war between Europe and the Middle East would wage on for almost 8 years, and not because a winner necessarily was declared. By 2060, the Middle East ran dry just like the USA, and with no gold to be fought over for any of the nations involved, a victor isn't crowned, with both sides facing a considerable loss of human life. In the shadow of war, a mysterious illness managed to poke through during the 2050s, at a time when so many nations were beginning to cannibalize each other for their country's resources. It would seem odd, however, that a random illness called the New Plague began to spread across the United States, a highly contagious disease that began with profuse sweating, escalating to bodily contusions and swelling, and its final symptom involved external hemorrhaging and blood loss. The plague fueled national paranoia as citizens ceased social gatherings, and the US government officially shut down its borders by 2053, after tens of thousands died from the disease. The timing of the plague's outbreak was seemingly out of left field, but by 2055, West Tech established a research facility after being enlisted by the US government to determine a cure. In creating the research center and disaster relief, government officials used the opportunity to register civilians during the pandemic, taking full advantage of the plague's events to fuel anti-communist sentiment and control public narratives. West Tech in turn officially forms the Pan-Immunity Virion Research Project out of the ensuing madness years later in 2073, a precursor to the forced evolutionary virus that would eventually create the franchise's super mutants. The mysterious arrival of the plague and the future use of chemical weapons by the People's Republic of China spawned beliefs that they might have been the cause of the outbreak. 2060 was an important year, not just because the UN collapsed, but it was also a time when the world literally appeared to stop turning. The ensuing world events surrounding the aggressive actions taken to claim fossil fuels put a clamp on who could actually use the very little combustion fuel reserves left remaining. The world's roads no longer saw the consistent use of automobiles, and traffic across the worldwide streets was almost non-existent. The focus and world pressure to research portable fusion power grows, but not on a scale wide enough to truly allow for the world's economies to recover. The fission battery helped to provide portable power for a time, notably within robotics and some vehicles, until the Chrysler Corporation began integrating fusion power to develop their Corvega brand of vehicles. First entering the market in 2070, these new automobiles premiered at a hefty cost of $199,999.99. But fortunately, they had a small upkeep cost. But in the post-apocalyptic world, they're rendered functionally inert due to the electromagnetic pulses used to detonate nuclear bombs. Not long before this point in 2059, the United States sought to protect its interests as the Alaskan pipeline remained as one of the biggest assets in the world for crude oil. Due to this, the U.S. began to ensure that its military presence matched the severity of its importance, establishing the Anchorage front line. But at the risk of its relationship with Canada, the tensions would continue for several years into the year 2066, as Canada continued to voice its frustration, refusing open access to Canadian soil and airspace. This would come to a head when the United States annexes Canada in 2072, with Canada officially ceasing to exist as a nation by 2077. Halfway across the world, the People's Republic of China would place similar pressure on the United States in its negotiations for sharing energy sources, and trade negotiations began to break down as the world's leading manufacturer faced a massive energy crisis. As the world leaders refused to find any middle ground, relations between the two ceased, leading to a showdown between the last superpowers on the planet. The Sino-American War officially began in 2066, under the command of General Jing Wei, when Alaska was invaded by airborne Chinese forces. The critical asset of the Alaskan pipeline was forcefully taken, as the American military had no choice but to retreat from the surprise attack. While China committed provocative actions with a failed counterintelligence mission only 4 years before, called the Niagara Sabotage, the wide-scale takeover of the pipeline ushered in an era that unfortunately mirrored the similar European and Middle Eastern conflict just years earlier. Largely a trench warfare effort, Chinese and United States forces sacrificed human life to potentially win a game of inches. The harsh conditions of the Alaskan climate and the technology limitations of both sides initially led to a stalemate as China siphoned off of the pipeline and United States infrastructure, while Canada continued to put pressure on the U.S., preventing them from having strategic advantages and airspace. The initial years of the war were largely conventional, but developments were about to change the tide. United States forces may have been pushed back by the Chinese at first, but the T-45 power armor would make its debut on the fields of battle in January of 2067. The arrival of the crude power armor suits allowed the U.S. to finally punch back at the Chinese tanks and machinery that occupied the earlier invasion. While it may have felt like this could shift the direction of the occupation of Alaska, the war would mostly be a stalemate until the T-51 winterized power armor premieres in June of 2076. The increased mobility of the suits allowed for U.S. forces to punch through Chinese lines that had previously been fiercely held. A triumph for General Constantine Chase, who had sought several solutions to winning the war, including the failed Liberty Prime concept, a 40-foot-tall robot that government contractors could not deploy in time for war efforts. After almost a decade, Chinese forces faced separate military engagements in Alaska, the Gobi Desert, and invasion of American forces in east-central China under the Yangtze Campaign. Anchorage, Alaska, however, would be reclaimed by January 10th of 2077, but mainline China warfare would continue onward up until October of that year. Fighting continued to rage on into the Philippine Islands, and by this point the U.S. president was missing, abandoning the White House and joining the ranks of the Enclave, a secret shadow government of high-ranking officials. With no official direction from the government and an unwinnable war, A stalemate between China and the US was once again the result of years of fighting. Negotiations began to potentially end the Sino-American War, but ultimately, these would never materialize. The morning of October 23, 2077, marked the full collapse of any hopes that the world could recover from decades of conflict. Only minutes into the day, Chinese subs were witnessed off the coast of California, and several hours later, high-altitude bombers were sighted near the Bering Strait. At 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 missile launches were confirmed, and 13 minutes later, the U.S. President authorized a retaliatory strike. During the launch of American weapons, Chinese nuclear strikes hit Pennsylvania and New York at 9:42 Eastern Standard Time, and 5 minutes later, the country was offline as Boston and Washington, D.C. were also struck by attacks, with the eastern seaboard being attacked by the Yangtze submarine held within Boston's harbor. The West Coast by this point had already been completely destroyed, with Los Angeles suffering direct hits to its most center point. Las Vegas was one of the few areas relatively untouched, as a defense system designed by Robco's CEO, Robert House, prevented 68 of 77 targeted warheads from hitting the city. For 2 hours, the nuclear devastation slowly ravaged the entire planet, with electromagnetic pulses used to design the bombs, knocking out worldwide communications and transportation. Relief efforts were impossible due to disabled equipment, and impending radiation sickness slowly impacts all those who were unable to reach protection. By its end, 7.54 billion people would lose their lives. One of Fallout's biggest mysteries involves tracing the events of the day that the bombs fell. While ultimately China appeared to make the first strikes, prompting the US to retaliate, there are several vantage points to consider for how the events potentially transpired, a debate fans have had ever since Fallout's debut. Fallout's original creator Tim Kaine disclosed in an interview with TK's Mantis that China fired the first weapons due to Westech's creation of forced evolutionary virus, as the virus's creation had leaked out of their top-secret facility, reaching Chinese intelligence. When the bombs fell, FEV and the combined radiation ushered in an era of mutation and immeasurable impact to what would become the wasteland of the United States. The decision to fire first could easily have been influenced by trying to trap FEV in North America, so that it had no chance to reach international borders. For fans who don't believe Kaine, however, another enduring theory surrounds an unused treatment written by Brent V. Friedman for Interplay Films in 1998. The unused Fallout movie concept positioned Vault-Tec to be the primary aggressor in dropping the first bombs that kickstart the war. The same idea would be revisited and entered into series canon on Fallout's first season on Amazon Prime. And while some now believe that Vault-Tec officially fired the first strikes, it's confirmed that they definitely had the means to start the war and were committed to doing so to guarantee success for their shareholders. It remains to be seen if this is how the scenario exactly played out, but Fallout's TV show officially is canon according to Bethesda and the show's producers, so what we'll end up getting will overwrite any thoughts Tim Kaine might have had. And with that, we've explored the considerable lore behind the Great War of Fallout's history, and the events leading up to the devastation that destroyed its world. Did we miss any facts you'd like to point out about the war? Let us know in the comments, and for more content just like this video, check out the full Fallout Stories playlist linked here. And until next time, pop culture nerds, keep on dissecting. This is Mark signing off.